Story 1. Some operations are so classified that even decades later, the full truth never sees daylight. And what happened to Agent Marcus Webb in 1987 should have stayed buried forever. Webb had been deep undercover for 3 years inside a human trafficking ring operating along the Mexican border when his handler received a message that made his blood run cold. The message contained only 4 words: "They know who I am." That was the last confirmed communication from Webb, but what investigators found 6 months later in an abandoned meat processing plant just outside El Paso would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. My name is Mubarok, and welcome to Lunar Lore. And tonight we're diving into 4 undercover operations that spiraled into nightmares nobody could have predicted. Marcus Webb wasn't supposed to be in that facility. His assignment was simple, at least on paper: infiltrate the organization, gather evidence, and report back. He'd done everything right. He had a perfect cover story, forged documents that could withstand scrutiny, and years of field experience. But somewhere along the line, something went catastrophically wrong. When the FBI finally got a warrant to search the meat processing plant based on an anonymous tip, they expected to find evidence of the trafficking operation. What they found instead was a room in the basement that wasn't on any of the building's blueprints. The room was sealed with a steel door that required industrial cutting equipment to open. The smell that emerged when they breached it was so overwhelming that 3 agents vomited immediately. Inside, the walls were covered in writing, thousands of words scratched into the concrete with what appeared to be fingernails and pieces of metal. Most of it was incomprehensible, fragments of thoughts and desperate pleas. But one section stood out. Written in larger letters near the back wall was a detailed account of what Webb had discovered. According to the writing, the trafficking ring was a front for something far worse. Webb had learned that certain clients weren't buying people for labor or exploitation in any conventional sense. They were buying them for experiments. The organization had connections to a private research facility that was conducting unauthorized medical trials, testing experimental drugs and procedures on people who would never be reported missing. Webb had documented names, dates, and locations, and he'd planned to extract himself and deliver the information. But someone inside law enforcement had tipped off the organization. The betrayal came from his own handler, Agent Thomas Richter, who'd been taking payments for years to ensure certain operations looked the other way. When Richter realized Webb was getting too close to information that could expose him, he'd fed Webb's real identity to the organization. They'd grabbed Webb during what was supposed to be a routine meeting, and instead of killing him outright, they'd locked him in that room as a message to anyone else who might try to investigate. The writing on the walls detailed Webb's captivity. For the first week, they'd kept him alive, bringing minimal food and water, while they decided what to do with him. Webb had used that time to scratch his discoveries into the concrete, hoping someone would eventually find it. He described hearing screams from other rooms, sounds of medical equipment, and conversations between people who spoke clinically about their test subjects, as if they were discussing livestock. He wrote about a woman in the next room who'd begged for help until her voice gave out, and a young man who'd been taken away and never brought back. The details Webb scratched into those walls revealed a network that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. He'd identified at least 3 other facilities operating in Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Texas. He documented a sophisticated system for selecting victims, people who were already marginalized, undocumented immigrants, homeless individuals, anyone whose disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate investigation. The organization had been operating for at least a decade, possibly longer, and they'd refined their methods to near perfection. Webb wrote about the personnel he'd encountered. There were the traffickers themselves, brutal men who saw their captives as nothing more than merchandise. But there were also the researchers, people with medical degrees and scientific credentials who treated human suffering as data points. He described overhearing a conversation where 2 doctors discussed the results of a drug trial that had killed 4 people, and their only concern was whether the deaths had compromised the validity of their research. They talked about adjusting dosages and trying again with the next batch of subjects. On the 8th day, according to the final entries, they'd started using Webb for their experiments. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as he described being injected with substances that caused hallucinations, paralysis, and excruciating pain. He wrote about losing track of time, about moments of clarity between periods of delirium, about the fear that he would die without anyone knowing what had happened to him. One entry described a drug that made him feel like his skin was on fire, while simultaneously paralyzing him so completely that he couldn't even scream. Another described something that caused such intense paranoia that he became convinced the concrete walls were closing in on him, suffocating him slowly. Webb documented the medical procedures in disturbing detail. They'd performed a spinal tap without anesthesia. They'd inserted devices under his skin to monitor his vital signs during drug trials. They'd taken tissue samples from various organs, using needles that felt like they were tearing him apart from the inside. And through it all, they'd kept him conscious, apparently because they needed to monitor his responses and couldn't risk sedation interfering with their results. The last coherent sentence read, "If you're reading this, Richter sold me out. Don't let him get away with it." But there were more marks after that. Increasingly incomprehensible scratches that might have been attempts at writing, or might have been nothing more than the random movements of someone too far gone to form thoughts anymore. The forensic team that analyzed the room estimated that Webb had survived at least 3 weeks, possibly longer, based on the progression of the writing and the physical evidence. The FBI found Webb's body in the corner of the room, partially decomposed. The autopsy revealed multiple injection sites, signs of malnutrition and dehydration, and evidence of experimental drugs in his system that weren't approved for human use. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of surgical incisions that had been made and then sutured closed, suggesting they'd been testing surgical techniques on him while he was still alive. The medical examiner found evidence of exploratory surgery on Webb's abdomen. His chest cavity had been opened and closed at least twice, and there were signs of organ biopsy on his liver and kidneys. Toxicology reports identified at least 7 different experimental compounds in Webb's tissues, none of which existed in any official pharmaceutical database. Chemical analysis suggested they were variations of existing drugs, modified in ways that would never pass regulatory approval. One compound appeared to be a derivative of a known chemotherapy agent, but altered to be far more toxic. Another seemed designed to suppress immune response, possibly for organ transplant research. A third caused cellular breakdown at an accelerated rate, its purpose unclear, but its effects devastating. The investigation that followed was massive but carefully controlled. Richter was arrested quietly, without media coverage, and charged under sealed indictments. His interrogation revealed the scope of his betrayal. He'd been compromised nearly a decade earlier when the organization had discovered his gambling debts and offered to pay them off in exchange for information. At first, it had been small things warning them about planned raids, tipping them off when informants were getting too close. But over time, his involvement had deepened until he was actively protecting their operations and feeding them agents who got too curious. Richter claimed he'd never intended for Webb to be tortured. He'd thought they would just kill him quickly and dispose of the body. When he learned what had actually happened, he said, he'd been horrified. But by then he was in too deep to come forward without destroying his own life. The interrogators didn't believe his remorse was genuine. They'd found evidence that Richter had received substantial payments throughout Webb's captivity, payments that increased as the experiments continued, suggesting he'd been compensated for providing them with a federal agent as a test subject. Richter hanged himself in his cell before trial, leaving a note that admitted to the betrayal, but claimed he'd never intended for Webb to be tortured. The note also contained a list of names, other law enforcement officials who'd been compromised by the organization. Some of those named were investigated and quietly forced into retirement. Others were never officially touched, their names buried in classified files that would remain sealed for decades. The FBI's Internal Affairs Division spent years trying to clean house, but they could never be certain they'd found everyone. The trafficking ring was dismantled, but the research facility Webb had mentioned was never officially found. Several agents involved in the investigation reported being told to drop certain leads, and documents related to the facility disappeared from evidence storage. One investigator, a veteran agent named Robert Cole, became obsessed with finding the facility. He spent his own money traveling to the locations Webb had identified, interviewing people in the area, searching for any sign of the operation. He found abandoned buildings that showed signs of recent medical use, locals who remembered seeing trucks with medical equipment coming and going at odd hours, but no concrete proof. Cole's personal investigation turned up witnesses who described seeing people being moved in and out of a facility outside of Tucson. They remembered armed guards, high fences, and the sound of generators running constantly. But when Cole brought investigators to the location, they found nothing but an empty warehouse that had been thoroughly cleaned. Soil samples revealed traces of medical waste and chemical compounds, but not enough to prove anything definitional. It was clear the facility had been there, and equally clear that it had been professionally sanitized. 3 people who'd been held at the research facility were eventually located alive, though none of them could provide coherent testimony about where they'd been held. They all described similar experiences, being kept sedated, waking up during procedures, and being moved between locations while blindfolded. One woman had scars consistent with Webb's description of surgical experiments. She described waking up during an operation where they were removing part of her liver. The pain so intense, she passed out again, then waking up days later in a different room with no memory of the time in between. Another survivor, a man named Carlos, had been used for neurological experiments. He described having electrodes attached to his skull, being subjected to electrical stimulation that caused seizures and hallucinations. The researchers had apparently been studying pain response and consciousness, deliberately keeping subjects awake during procedures to observe their reactions. Carlos suffered permanent neurological damage and struggled with seizures and memory problems for the rest of his life. The third survivor, a teenage girl named Maria, had been used for pharmaceutical trials. She'd been injected with dozens of experimental compounds over several months, each one causing different horrible effects. One made her bleed from her eyes and nose. Another caused such severe muscle spasms that she broke her own arm. A third put her into a coma for nearly a week. She'd survived only because she'd been young and healthy when they took her, her body able to withstand the abuse that killed older or weaker subjects. All 3 were placed in witness protection, but their testimonies were deemed too unreliable for prosecution, likely due to the psychological trauma and the drugs they'd been given. Defense attorneys would have torn them apart on the stand, questioning their memories and their mental stability. The prosecutors made the calculation that it was better to take plea deals from the traffickers they could definitively prove were guilty rather than risk losing everything by relying on traumatized witnesses who couldn't remember basic details like dates or locations. The meat processing plant was demolished 6 months after the investigation concluded, officially due to structural concerns. The demolition happened unusually fast, with the contract awarded to a company that had no previous experience with similar projects. The land was purchased by a shell corporation that couldn't be traced to any individual or known entity. Local residents reported seeing unusual activity at the site late at night during the demolition, including trucks arriving and leaving without explanation, but no investigation was ever launched. One demolition worker later came forward anonymously, claiming they'd found additional rooms during the teardown that hadn't been in the building plans. He described finding what looked like an operating theater in a sub-basement, complete with surgical equipment and restraints built into the table. He'd reported it to his supervisor, who'd told him to keep his mouth shut and finish the job. The worker said they'd been ordered to crush everything into dust, to leave nothing identifiable, and they'd been paid triple their normal rate to work overnight and keep quiet about what they'd seen. Webb's family was told he'd died in the line of duty during a classified operation, but they were never given details. His name was added to a memorial wall at FBI headquarters, and his case file was sealed for 75 years. His younger sister, Elizabeth, spent decades trying to get answers about what had happened to her brother. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests that were denied on national security grounds. She hired lawyers who hit dead ends. She contacted journalists who found their investigations blocked at every turn. Elizabeth eventually connected with other families who'd lost relatives to the trafficking ring. Together, they formed a support group and advocacy organization pushing for transparency and accountability. They held annual memorials, gave interviews to any media outlet that would listen, and lobbied Congress for investigations. Some years, a sympathetic representative would hold a hearing, but nothing ever came of it. The official line never changed. The case was classified. The operation was successful. The details could not be disclosed without compromising national security. One of the agents who'd found Webb's body, a woman named Sarah Chen, couldn't let it go. She spent years quietly investigating on her own time, tracking down leads that the official investigation had abandoned. Chen was meticulous and patient. She built timelines, cross-referenced financial records, interviewed hundreds of people who might have had any connection to the case. She discovered that the research facility was likely funded by a combination of private pharmaceutical companies and off-the-books government contracts related to developing interrogation drugs and bioweapons. Chen found financial records suggesting that several high-ranking officials had known about the facility and had protected it in exchange for access to the research. The experiments weren't just random cruelty. They were producing data that certain people found valuable. She traced payments from Department of Defense contractors to shell companies that owned the facilities. She found evidence of research reports being circulated among military intelligence agencies, reports that detailed the results of experiments on unwilling human subjects. The deeper Chen dug, the more dangerous her investigation became. She started noticing surveillance, cars following her home from work, clicking sounds on her phone line. Her apartment was broken into, though nothing was taken. Just her files disturbed enough that she'd know someone had been looking through them. She received anonymous warnings telling her to drop the investigation for her own safety. But Chen had seen what they'd done to Webb, and she couldn't walk away. In 2003, Chen was killed in what was officially ruled a random mugging gone wrong. She was shot twice in an alley behind a restaurant where she'd been meeting with a potential witness. The witness disappeared and was never identified. Chen's personal investigation files were never found. though colleagues reported she'd kept extensive notes and documentation at her home. When police searched her apartment, it had been thoroughly cleaned out. Her computer's hard drive had been professionally wiped, and her backup drives were missing. The detective assigned to Chen's murder case found the whole situation suspicious, but his attempts to investigate were shut down by his superiors. He was told that Chen had been working on classified matters, and that federal authorities would handle it from there. No federal investigation ever materialized, at least not one that produced any public results. The case went cold, officially unsolved, though everyone who'd known Chen understood exactly what had happened to her. Years later, in 2019, a former pharmaceutical executive named Dr. James Morrison came forward with information about the research facility. Morrison was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience. He described being approached in the late 1980s by government contractors who wanted to fund human trials of experimental drugs without going through normal regulatory channels. They'd promised him the research would be used for national security purposes, that the subjects would be volunteers, that everything was legal and sanctioned at the highest levels. Morrison had believed them, or at least he'd chosen to believe them, because the funding was substantial and the research was fascinating. He'd provided chemical compounds and technical expertise, never asking too many questions about where the research was being conducted or who the subjects really were. He'd received reports on the results, data that had helped his company develop several profitable drugs that eventually made it to market through legitimate channels. But Morrison had started having doubts when he noticed that some of the test subjects in the reports were being used for multiple trials simultaneously, something that would never happen in ethical research. He'd asked questions and been told not to worry about the details. When he'd pushed harder, he'd been quietly removed from the project and paid a substantial sum to sign a non-disclosure agreement. He'd taken the money and told himself he'd done nothing wrong, but the guilt had eaten at him for decades. Morrison's deathbed confession provided some answers, but raised even more questions. He named other companies and individuals involved in the program, but most of them denied any knowledge or hid behind NDAs and classified contracts. The media coverage was minimal and quickly faded. A few investigative journalists tried to follow up, but they hit the same walls that had stopped Chen years earlier. Documents were classified, witnesses recanted or disappeared, and official sources refused to comment. Story 2: Detective Laura Santos had worked undercover in gang operations for 7 years without incident, but her assignment in 2012 to infiltrate a street gang in Detroit's East Side would end with her struggling to distinguish between her real identity and the persona she'd created. The operation was supposed to last 6 months, gather evidence of drug trafficking and weapons sales, then extract her safely. Instead, it lasted 3 years and ended with Santos in a psychiatric facility, unable to remember who she was supposed to be. The gang called themselves the East Side Disciples, and they controlled several blocks of territory through a combination of drug sales, protection rackets and carefully orchestrated violence. Santos went in as Laura Martinez, a woman with a criminal record that had been carefully fabricated, someone looking to make money and willing to do what it took. She'd played similar roles before, and she was confident she could maintain the separation between her real self and her cover identity. The first year went smoothly. Santos worked her way into the organization's lower ranks, proving herself reliable and keeping her reporting to her handlers minimal and carefully timed. She learned the hierarchy, documented the supply chains, and identified key players. But she also found herself developing genuine relationships with people she was supposed to be investigating. A young single mother named Keisha who sold drugs to feed her kids. A teenager named Devon who'd joined the gang because his older brother had been killed by a rival group, and he wanted protection. These weren't abstract criminals in a report anymore. They were people with stories and reasons. Keisha had been working as a nurse's aide before her childcare fell through, and she lost her job. She'd tried to make it work through legitimate means, applying for assistance, looking for work she could do with her kids. But nothing had worked out. The gang offered her a way to feed her children, and she'd taken it. Santos watched Keisha struggle with the moral weight of what she was doing, saw her cry after making sales, heard her pray for forgiveness and a way out. It was impossible not to feel for her. Devon was 17 and trying to finish high school while running drugs for the gang. His mother had died of cancer the year before, and his older brother Marcus had been all the family he had left. When Marcus was killed in a drive-by, Devon had been faced with a choice: join the gang for protection and income, or be alone and vulnerable in a neighborhood where being unaffiliated made you a target. He'd chosen survival. Santos helped him with his homework sometimes, encouraged him to stay in school, and hated herself for knowing that when the operation ended, he'd likely end up in prison. Her handler, Lieutenant Marcus Freeman, started noticing changes in her reports. Santos was including more context about the individuals, expressing concerns about what would happen to some of them when the operation concluded, questioning whether arresting everyone would actually solve anything, or just create a power vacuum for another gang to fill. Freeman warned her that she was getting too close, that she needed to maintain professional distance, but Santos insisted she was fine. Freeman should have recognized the warning signs. He'd run undercover operations before and had seen agents start to identify with their targets. But Santos was producing excellent intelligence, and the case was building into something significant. He convinced himself that she was just being thorough, that her emotional involvement was controlled and professional. He made the mistake of prioritizing the case over the agent's well-being. In the second year, things escalated. The gang's leader, a man called Prophet, started using Santos for more serious work. She witnessed murders. She participated in beatings. She helped move weapons and drugs across state lines. Each time, she told herself it was necessary to maintain her cover and gather evidence. But each time it became harder to shake off what she'd done. She started having nightmares, where she couldn't tell if she was Laura Santos or Laura Martinez, where the faces of victims blurred together, where she'd wake up unsure which life was real. The nightmares were vivid and specific. In one recurring dream, she'd be testifying in court as Detective Santos, but every time she tried to speak, Laura Martinez's voice would come out, using street slang and admitting to crimes. In another, she'd be at her real family's house for dinner, but she'd look down and see blood on her hands from something Laura Martinez had done, and no one else at the table could see it. She started drinking to sleep, vodka straight from the bottle, until she passed out, because unconsciousness was better than those dreams. She started missing check-ins with Freeman, going weeks without contact. When they did meet, she'd be evasive about her mental state, deflecting his concerns with jokes or anger. Freeman documented his concerns in his reports, covering himself administratively, but he didn't force the issue. The intelligence Santos was gathering was too valuable, and shutting down the operation would mean losing everything they'd built. Prophet was paranoid and ruthless, and he ran the disciples with an iron fist. He'd come up through the streets, survived multiple attempts on his life, and trusted no one completely. But he valued competence and loyalty, and Laura Martinez had proven both. He started bringing her into higher-level meetings, introducing her to suppliers and distributors, trusting her with information that could dismantle the entire operation. Santos documented everything: the suppliers who brought drugs up from Mexico, the corrupt cops who provided protection, the money laundering schemes running through local businesses, the politicians who took bribes to look the other way. She was building a Raicho case that would put dozens of people away for decades. But she was also becoming Laura Martinez more thoroughly than she'd ever intended. The breaking point came during the third year. Prophet had become convinced there was an informant in the organization. He'd already killed 2 people on suspicion alone, interrogating them brutally before executing them in front of the entire gang as a warning. Santos knew she was under scrutiny. Prophet watched her more carefully now, tested her loyalty with increasingly dangerous assignments, pushed her to prove herself. To prove her loyalty, she was ordered to execute someone Prophet believed was talking to police. The target was a low-level dealer named Marcus, coincidentally the same name as her handler, who'd been skimming product and was suspected of cooperating with authorities. Prophet handed Santos a gun and told her this was her moment to prove she was really committed to the disciples, that she wasn't just playing at being one of them. Santos met with Freeman in a panic, begging to be extracted. But Freeman told her that if she left now, 3 years of work would be wasted and dozens of dangerous criminals would walk free. He told her to do whatever she had to do to maintain her cover, and he'd figure out a way to protect the target through other channels. He promised her that backup would be in place, that Marcus, the dealer, would be arrested on separate charges before the execution could happen, that she wouldn't actually have to go through with it. It was the wrong call, and both of them knew it, but they were in too deep to see another way out. Freeman was thinking about the case, about all the work they'd done, about the prosecutors who were waiting for this evidence, about his career and reputation. Santos was thinking about survival, about not blowing her cover, about making it through one more day as Laura Martinez. Neither of them was thinking clearly about the human cost. The promised backup never materialized. Freeman had tried to coordinate with local police to arrest Marcus the dealer on unrelated charges, but the timing hadn't worked out. Miscommunication, bureaucratic delays, and bad luck meant that when Santos went to the meeting where she was supposed to prove herself, Marcus was still alive and Prophet was waiting to watch her kill him. Santos went to the meeting in an abandoned warehouse. Marcus was there, tied to a chair, beaten but conscious. Prophet stood watching with several of his lieutenants, and the message was clear. This wasn't optional, and there wouldn't be another chance. Santos felt like she was watching herself from outside her body. Laura Martinez raised the gun. Detective Laura Santos screamed silently in her head, begging herself to stop, to find another way, to accept that the operation was over and extract herself even if it meant failure. But in that moment, something in Santos broke. She didn't see Marcus the dealer anymore. She didn't see a target or a victim or a person. She saw 3 years of violence and lies and moral compromise coalescing into this single moment. She saw every terrible thing she'd witnessed and participated in as Laura Martinez. She saw the impossibility of maintaining two identities that were fundamentally opposed to each other, and she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She raised the gun, but instead of shooting Marcus, she turned it on Prophet. The shot hit him in the chest before anyone could react. Then everything was chaos. Gunfire erupted as Prophet's bodyguards returned fire. Santos took 2 bullets, one in the shoulder and one in the leg, but she managed to kill Prophet and one of the guards before going down. Marcus, the dealer, managed to free himself in the confusion and ran, surviving the encounter. Other gang members scattered, not sure who was shooting at whom or why. When backup finally arrived, responding to reports of shots fired, they found Santos bleeding out on the floor, clutching her badge and screaming that she was a cop, that she needed help, that she couldn't remember her real name. The EMTs who treated her said she kept alternating between English and Spanish, between formal speech and street slang, between calling herself Detective Santos and calling herself Martinez. She was in shock from blood loss, but there was something else wrong too. Something deeper than physical trauma. She survived the physical injuries. The bullets hadn't hit anything vital, and the surgeons were able to repair the damage, but the psychological damage was severe. In the hospital, she alternated between identifying as Detective Laura Santos and as Laura Martinez, the gang member. She had vivid memories of both lives and couldn't always tell which were real. She remembered graduating from the police academy, the pride on her parents' faces, the weight of the badge when it was first pinned to her chest. But she also remembered her first drug deal as Laura Martinez, the fear and exhilaration, the way Prophet had nodded approvingly. She remembered her real family, Sunday dinners and birthday parties, and her sister's wedding. But she also remembered the fictional backstory that had been created for Laura Martinez, an abusive childhood and time in juvenile detention and survival on the streets. And sometimes the fictional memories felt more real than the actual ones. Her brain had spent 3 years reinforcing the cover identity, creating neural pathways and emotional associations, and now it couldn't simply discard all of that. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with a severe dissociative disorder brought on by prolonged undercover work and traumatic stress. She'd spent so long being Laura Martinez, making life or death decisions in that identity, that her brain had started treating both identities as equally real. The technical term they used was dissociative identity confusion, a psychological state where the boundaries between cover identity and real identity break down completely. The treatment was slow and difficult. Traditional therapy approaches didn't quite fit because Laura Martinez wasn't a separate personality in the clinical sense. She was an elaborate performance that had become indistinguishable from reality. The psychiatrist treating her, Dr. Raymond Michaels, had never dealt with a case quite like this. He consulted with experts in trauma and dissociation, with other psychiatrists who'd treated undercover agents, trying to find an approach that would work. Dr. Michaels explained that Santos's brain had essentially created 2 complete autobiographical memories, 2 sets of emotional responses, 2 ways of interacting with the world. The challenge wasn't just helping her recognize which memories were real and which were fabricated. It was helping her understand that both sets of experiences had shaped who she was now, and she couldn't simply erase 3 years of her life, even if those years had been lived under a false identity. The Ryko case proceeded without her testimony. Prosecutors used the evidence she'd gathered, the documentation and recordings and witness statements. But Santos was deemed mentally unfit to testify. Many of the charges were reduced or dropped due to the lack of her first-hand testimony. The corruption she'd uncovered within the police department was quietly handled through internal affairs, with several officers retiring rather than facing prosecution. The cartel connections were never fully investigated because following those leads would have required Santos's cooperation and knowledge. Freeman was reprimanded but not fired. The official report criticized his judgment in keeping Santos undercover too long and failing to extract her when she showed signs of psychological stress. But the report also acknowledged that he'd been under pressure from superiors to keep the operation running, that the case had been deemed too important to shut down prematurely. Freeman was transferred to a desk job where he couldn't make similar decisions about agents in the field. Freeman retired 3 years later with full benefits, but colleagues said he'd changed. He'd aged rapidly after the operation ended, his hair going white, deep lines appearing in his face. He started drinking heavily, not enough to get fired, but enough that everyone noticed. At his retirement party, he gave a speech that was supposed to be celebratory, but instead became a warning to younger officers about the cost of ambition about remembering that agents in the field were people and not just tools to be used. Santos spent 18 months in a psychiatric facility. Through intensive therapy, medication, and time, she slowly regained a more stable sense of self. She came to intellectually understand that Laura Martinez wasn't real, that the memories associated with that identity were fabrications she'd created for professional purposes. But emotionally, those memories and experiences remained vivid and meaningful. She could know that Laura Martinez was a role she'd played, but she couldn't make herself stop feeling the emotions attached to that role. She remembered caring about Keisha and Devon, as Laura Martinez would have, and those feelings didn't disappear just because she knew the identity was fabricated. She still worried about what had happened to Keisha's kids, whether they'd ended up in foster care when their mother was arrested. She still wondered if Devon had finished high school or if he'd dropped out to take over part of the disciples' territory after Prophet died. These people had been real, even if her identity, when interacting with them, had been false. When she was finally released from the facility, Santos tried to return to normal life, but everything felt wrong. The police department offered her a disability retirement, which she accepted. She couldn't go back to police work. The department wouldn't clear her for duty, and she didn't want to anyway. She couldn't maintain relationships with family and friends who knew her before the operation because they treated her like a victim, and she resented their pity. Her parents tried to be supportive, but they didn't understand what she'd been through. They'd say things like, "You're safe now," and "You can put it behind you," not realizing that she couldn't put it behind her because part of her was still Laura Martinez, still carrying the weight of things she'd done in that identity. Her sister tried to include her in family events, but Santos would sit there feeling like an outsider, watching people live normal lives and unable to connect with that normalcy. She moved to a different city, changed her name legally to something new, neither Laura Santos nor Laura Martinez, trying to create a third identity that could reconcile the two. She chose the name Emma Reyes, something that felt neutral, that carried no history or associations. She found work as a security consultant, using her experience in a way that didn't require her to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She built a quiet life, careful not to get too close to anyone, afraid that if people really knew her, they'd see the fractures. In 2019, a journalist tracking down people involved in the operation found Santos, now Reyes, living alone in a small apartment in Cleveland. The journalist, a woman named Patricia Holt, was writing a book about the psychological cost of undercover work. She'd interviewed dozens of former agents and wanted to include Santos's story. Santos initially refused, but Holt was persistent and eventually convinced her to talk, promising anonymity. The interview lasted 6 hours, spread across multiple sessions. Santos, or Rise, as she now called herself, described her experience as feeling like she'd lived 2 complete lives simultaneously, and having to choose which one was real felt like murdering a part of herself. She said the worst part wasn't the violence she'd witnessed or participated in, It was the genuine relationships she'd formed under false pretenses. People who'd trusted Laura Martinez and who would never know that person didn't really exist. She talked about Keisha, who'd been sentenced to 15 years for drug trafficking. Santos had written her a letter while in the psychiatric facility, trying to apologize and explain, but Keisha had never responded. Santos didn't blame her. How could you explain to someone that your entire friendship had been a lie, but also that the feelings had been real? It was an impossible contradiction, and Santos lived with that contradiction every day. She talked about Devon, who'd been 17 when Santos met him, and who'd be in his mid-20s now. She'd tried to find out what happened to him, but couldn't get information. She hoped he'd gotten out, finished school, made something of his life. But she feared he'd ended up dead, or in prison like so many others. And she hated that she'd contributed to that her investigation had led to arrests that had destabilized the neighborhood and potentially made things worse for kids like Devon. The journalist asked if she regretted becoming a cop. Santos thought for a long time before answering. She said she regretted that the system had used her up and thrown her away, that her handler had prioritized the case over her well-being, that nobody had prepared her for the psychological cost of long-term undercover work. But she didn't regret trying to make a difference. She just wished someone had told her that sometimes the person you lose in these operations is yourself, and that no case, no matter how important, is worth that cost. Holt's book was published in 2020 and included Santos's story, carefully anonymized but detailed enough that people involved in the operation would recognize it. The book received critical acclaim and prompted some discussions about reforming undercover operations, but no substantial policy changes resulted. Law enforcement agencies issued statements saying they took officer well-being seriously and had procedures in place to prevent situations like Santos's. But officers who read the book knew those statements were mostly public relations. Story 3. When FBI agent David Park volunteered for an undercover operation targeting a domestic terrorist cell in rural Montana in 2015. He thought he understood the risks, but what he didn't anticipate was that the group's ideology would start to make sense to him. And by the time he was extracted, he wasn't sure anymore which side he believed in. The operation was supposed to last 1 year, but Park stayed embedded for nearly 2. And when he finally came out, he brought with him questions that the Bureau didn't want to answer. The group called themselves the Sovereign Citizens Alliance, and they believed the federal government was illegitimate, that laws didn't apply to them, and that armed resistance was not only justified but necessary. They'd been linked to several attacks on government buildings, threats against federal employees, and a stockpile of illegal weapons. Park's job was to gather evidence of planned attacks, identify leadership, and help coordinate arrests before anyone got killed. Park's cover was perfect. He presented himself as a disillusioned veteran who'd lost faith in the government after serving overseas, someone angry about taxes and regulations, someone looking for like-minded people. The background was close enough to Park's real history to be believable, he actually had served in Iraq, and he actually had complicated feelings about what he'd seen and done there. The difference was that the real Park had channeled those feelings into law enforcement, while his cover identity had channeled them into anti-government extremism. The cell accepted him cautiously at first. They'd been infiltrated before, and were suspicious of newcomers, especially veterans, because they knew federal agencies often recruited from military populations. Park had to prove himself slowly, attending meetings without saying much, helping with tasks without asking questions, demonstrating that he could be trusted before they'd share anything sensitive. What surprised him was that many of the people in the group weren't the dangerous extremists he'd expected. They were farmers losing their land to bank foreclosures, veterans who felt abandoned by the VA, small business owners crushed by regulations they couldn't afford to comply with. They had legitimate grievances, real pain, and the group provided them with a sense of community and purpose that they couldn't find elsewhere. Park found himself listening to their stories and understanding, maybe for the first time, why someone would reach the conclusions they had. There was Tom Jensen, a third-generation rancher who'd lost his land after a dispute with the Bureau of Land Management over grazing rights. Tom had tried to fight the government through legal channels for years, hiring lawyers he couldn't afford, filing appeals that went nowhere, watching as his family's legacy was systematically destroyed by bureaucratic decisions that seemed designed to punish him for resisting. When legal options ran out, Tom had found the Sovereign Citizens Alliance, and they'd told him he didn't have to accept the government's authority, that he had natural rights that no court could take away. There was Sarah Mitchell, a single mother whose small restaurant had been shut down by health inspectors over violations she couldn't afford to fix. She'd tried to comply with regulations, but every time she fixed one thing, they'd find something else wrong. She'd gone into debt trying to keep up, and eventually she'd lost everything. The government had taken her business, her savings, her ability to provide for her kids, and when she'd tried to protest, they'd threatened her with additional fines and legal action. The Alliance had offered her solidarity and validation, told her she wasn't crazy for thinking the system was rigged against people like her. There was Marcus Webb, no relation to the other Marcus Webb, a veteran who'd been denied disability benefits despite documented injuries from his service. He'd been promised health care and support, but when he'd come home broken, the system had failed him repeatedly. Applications lost, appointments canceled, benefits denied for technical reasons that made no sense. He'd attempted suicide twice before finding the Alliance, and he credited them with saving his life by giving him a reason to keep fighting. Park documented all of this in his reports, trying to provide context for his handler, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh. But Walsh was focused on the criminal aspects, the weapons, the anti-government rhetoric, the potential for violence. She pushed Park to get information about planned attacks, not philosophizing about why people joined extremist groups. When Park tried to explain that understanding the why was important for preventing radicalization, Walsh told him that wasn't his job. The group's leader was a man named Robert Callahan, a former rancher who'd lost everything in a legal battle with the Bureau of Land Management over grazing rights. Callahan was intelligent and articulate, and he framed the group's ideology in terms of constitutional principles and individual liberty rather than violence. He ran study groups on constitutional law, American history, and political philosophy. He taught members how to file legal challenges to government authority, how to understand their rights, how to resist through documentation and peaceful non-compliance before resorting to anything more aggressive. Callahan talked about the Founding Fathers as revolutionaries who'd recognized that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of the people's rights, it's not just their right, but their duty to alter or abolish it. He quoted Jefferson and Madison and Paine, building an intellectual framework for resistance that was grounded in America's founding principles. And despite himself, Park found some of it compelling. Park had joined the FBI because he believed in law and order, in the necessity of government to maintain civil society, in the importance of institutions. But listening to Callahan and the others, he started questioning those assumptions. What if law and order sometimes meant injustice? What if institutions became corrupt and self-serving? What if the people who resisted weren't crazy extremists, but rational actors responding to real oppression? Park's handler, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, started noticing concerning patterns in his reports. Park was supposed to be documenting evidence of criminal activity, but instead, he was filing long analyses of the group's political philosophy and sympathetic portraits of individual members. When Walsh pressed him during check-ins, Park insisted he was just trying to provide context, but she could hear the change in his tone. He wasn't just pretending to agree with them anymore. He was actually considering their arguments. Walsh should have pulled him out then, but the operation was producing valuable intelligence. Park had identified members across 3 states, documented weapons caches, and recorded conversations that could be used as evidence of conspiracy. Walsh convinced herself that Park was still in control, that his sympathy for the group members was just professional empathy, that he'd maintain his objectivity when it mattered. The turning point came when the federal government raided a family's farm about 50 miles from where the group operated. The Graham family had refused to pay certain taxes they considered unconstitutional and had barricaded themselves on their property, declaring it sovereign territory. The standoff had lasted 3 weeks, with federal agents surrounding the property and the family refusing to surrender. The raid, when it finally came, was heavily armed and aggressive. Federal agents approached the house in armored vehicles, using loudspeakers to order the family to come out with their hands up. James Graham, the father, came out onto his porch holding a rifle, not pointing it at anyone, but carrying it openly as he believed was his right. An agent, claiming later that he'd feared for his life, shot Graham in the chest. Graham survived but was seriously injured. His wife and 3 children were arrested and charged with various federal crimes. The incident was ruled a justified use of force by internal review, but to the Sovereign Citizens Alliance, and to many in the surrounding community, it looked like government overreach and brutality. The Grahams had been peaceful. They'd harmed no one. They'd simply refused to comply with laws they considered unjust, and the government's response had been overwhelming violence. Park was with Callahan when they heard about the raid, and he watched as the news energized the group. This was exactly what Callahan had been warning about, proof that the government would use violence against citizens who resisted. Members who'd been wavering, who'd been considering whether the Alliance's rhetoric was too extreme, suddenly became committed believers. The raid had radicalized them more effectively than any of Callahan's speeches ever could have. The group started planning a response, and Park knew he should be reporting this to Walsh, that this was exactly the kind of domestic terrorism plot he was supposed to prevent. But he hesitated. He started asking himself uncomfortable questions. What if the group had a point? What if the government really was overstepping its authority? What if the people he was spying on were actually trying to defend their communities from real threats? Park had seen government overreach before. In Iraq, he'd witnessed military actions that killed civilians and were later justified with lies or classified as unavoidable collateral damage. He'd seen how power corrupts, how institutions protect themselves even when they're wrong, how the truth gets buried under layers of official narratives. He'd joined the FBI because he thought law enforcement in America would be different, more accountable, more just. But watching the government's response to the Grahams, he wasn't so sure anymore. When Park finally reported the group's plans to Walsh, he did so with reservations. He told her that the people involved weren't terrorists. They were desperate and scared. He argued for a softer approach, for trying to address their grievances rather than just arresting them. Walsh told him that wasn't his call to make and ordered him to continue gathering evidence. She thanked him for the information and told him the Bureau would handle it appropriately. The group's plan was to stage an armed occupation of a local government building to protest the raid on the Graham farm. It was meant to be nonviolent, a symbolic act of resistance similar to the Bundy standoff in Nevada years earlier. They would occupy the building, make their demands public, and refuse to leave until the government agreed to drop charges against the Grahams and address their grievances about constitutional violations. Callahan was clear about the rules of engagement. They would be armed, because the Second Amendment guaranteed that right, but they would not fire unless fired upon. They would damage no property, threaten no one, and maintain strict discipline. This was about making a statement, about standing up for principles, not about violence. Park believed Callahan meant it, believed the man was trying to prevent bloodshed, while still making a point that couldn't be ignored. Park tried to talk Callahan out of it, arguing that it would only give the government an excuse to crack down harder. But Callahan was determined. He said they'd tried peaceful protests and been ignored. They'd tried legal challenges and been defeated by technicalities. They'd tried working within the system and been systematically ground down. This was their last resort, the only way left to make their voices heard. And Park found that he didn't have a good counterargument. Park faced an impossible choice. If he warned the FBI, they would likely move in with overwhelming force, and people would probably die. If he didn't warn them, the occupation would happen anyway, and the outcome might be even worse. And underlying all of it was the question he couldn't escape. Was he trying to prevent violence? Or was he helping the government suppress legitimate dissent? He made his decision. He called Walsh and gave her detailed information about the plan, including the timing, the participants, and the weapons they'd be carrying. But he also pleaded with her to handle it carefully, to avoid violence if possible, to try to understand that these people felt they had no other options. Walsh thanked him for the information and told him to extract himself from the situation as quickly and safely as possible. She didn't make any promises about how the Bureau would handle it. The FBI's response was not what Park had hoped for. They coordinated with local police and set up a perimeter around the government building before the occupation could begin. They arrested 17 members of the alliance as they arrived for what they thought would be their peaceful occupation, including Callahan. The arrests were aggressive and militarized, with tactical teams, armored vehicles, and overwhelming force. It was exactly the kind of show of force that would confirm the group's worst fears about government tyranny. Park watched from a distance, wearing a wire, documenting everything for the Bureau's case file. He watched Tom Jensen being slammed against a police car, watched Sarah Mitchell crying as they handcuffed her, watched Marcus Webb freeze up with a PTSD flashback as armed agents surrounded him. None of them had fired a shot. None of them had threatened anyone. They'd simply shown up, and the government had treated them like enemy combatants. And Park, watching it all happen, felt like he'd betrayed people who had trusted him. He'd infiltrated their community, earned their confidence, learned their stories and their pain, and then he'd used that information to help the government destroy them. He told himself it was necessary, that he'd prevented potential violence, that this was his job. But it felt like betrayal nonetheless. In the aftermath, Park was commended for his work. The operation was considered a success. A domestic terrorist plot had been prevented, and dangerous individuals had been taken off the streets. His superiors praised his dedication and the quality of his intelligence gathering. But Park couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He started speaking out internally, questioning the Bureau's approach to groups like the Sovereign Citizens Alliance, arguing that treating every dissident as a terrorist only radicalized more people. His criticism didn't go over well. Park was called into meetings with senior agents who explained to him that policy decisions were above his pay grade. They told him that the Bureau appreciated his perspective, but that he needed to trust that leadership had access to information he didn't. that they understood the bigger picture. When Park continued pushing, questioning whether the bigger picture justified treating desperate citizens as enemy combatants, the meetings became less friendly. His superiors didn't appreciate the criticism. Park was reassigned to a desk job analyzing financial crimes, work that kept him away from undercover operations and minimized his contact with field agents. He underwent a mandatory psychological evaluation to determine if he'd been compromised during the operation. The evaluation concluded that he'd developed inappropriate sympathies with the target group, but that he wasn't a security risk. There were notes in his file about his inability to maintain professional objectivity and concerns about his suitability for future undercover work. Park's career with the FBI was effectively over. He still had a job, still collected a paycheck, but he'd been sidelined. He spent his days reviewing spreadsheets and writing reports that no one read, watching younger agents build careers while his stagnated. Colleagues avoided him, afraid that association with someone who'd been flagged for inappropriate sympathies might damage their own careers. Park had become a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when you started questioning the narrative. He resigned in 2017, turning in his badge and gun without ceremony, walking out of the FBI building for the last time and feeling nothing but relief. He disappeared from public life for several years, working various security jobs under his real name, but avoiding anything connected to law enforcement. He moved to a small town in Oregon, trying to figure out who he was now that he wasn't Agent Park anymore. Park resurfaced in 2021, writing articles under a pseudonym about federal overreach and the criminalization of political dissent. His writing was careful and well-researched, drawing on his FBI experience without revealing classified information. He never explicitly endorsed the Sovereign Citizens Alliance's actions, but he wrote sympathetically about their grievances and critically about the government's response. He argued that the distinction between patriot and extremist often depends on perspective, that history is full of people who resisted unjust laws and were later vindicated. Former colleagues who recognized his writing style were appalled. Some tried to reach out, to convince him he was wrong, to remind him of the oath he'd taken to uphold the law. Others reported his writings to the Bureau, concerned that he might be radicalizing others or sharing sensitive information. The FBI monitored his output, but didn't take action. He was careful to stay on the right side of legal lines, and prosecuting a former agent for exercising his First Amendment rights would be terrible optics. In a rare interview with an independent journalist in 2023, Park tried to explain himself. He said the operation had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about power and justice, about who gets to decide what counts as legitimate protest and what counts as terrorism. He said he still believed in law and order, but he no longer believed the government had a monopoly on defining those terms. He said going undercover had taught him that the line between patriot and extremist often depends on which side of the power structure you're standing on. The interviewer asked if he regretted his role in the operation. Park thought for a long time before answering. He said he regretted that people he'd come to respect were in prison, that their families had been torn apart, that their community had been traumatized by a militarized police response. But he also said he understood why the FBI did what it did, that there were real dangers in armed resistance movements, that violence could have broken out if the occupation had proceeded. He just wasn't sure anymore that the government's solution had made anything better. The arrests had scattered the Sovereign Citizens Alliance, but the ideology had spread. Other groups had formed, often more radical than Callahan's had been, inspired by what they saw as martyrdom. The underlying problems, the economic desperation and political alienation that had driven people to the alliance in the first place, remained unaddressed. The government had won the battle, but lost the war, and Park couldn't stop wondering if there'd been another way. Several members of the Sovereign Citizens Alliance were convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 to 20 years. Callahan received the longest sentence, 20 years in federal prison, and became something of a martyr figure in anti-government circles. His case was taken up by various advocacy groups who argued that his prosecution violated his First Amendment rights, that he'd been punished for his political beliefs rather than any actual crimes. The Graham family, whose treatment had sparked the planned occupation, eventually lost their farm to foreclosure. James Graham, still recovering from his gunshot wound, served 3 years in federal prison for assaulting a federal officer, a charge based on the fact that he'd been holding a rifle when he was shot. His wife was convicted of conspiracy and served 18 months. Their children were placed in foster care during the parents' incarceration and were eventually returned to the family, but the trauma had lasting effects. The community where the alliance had operated became more polarized. Some residents saw the arrests as necessary law enforcement, a proper response to dangerous extremists. Others saw them as proof of exactly what Callahan had been warning about: a government willing to use overwhelming force against citizens who dared to resist. Trust in federal authorities plummeted, and recruitment to anti-government groups in the region actually increased in the years following the operation. Park's former handler, Jennifer Walsh, defended the operation in testimony before a congressional committee reviewing FBI tactics against domestic extremism. She acknowledged that Park had raised concerns about the Bureau's approach, but argued that preventing violence had to be the priority. She noted that none of the arrested individuals had been killed during the operation, which she considered a success compared to other standoffs between government forces and armed groups like Ruby Ridge and Waco. Walsh's testimony was technically accurate, but missed Park's larger point. Yes, no one had died during the arrests, but that was only because the arrests had happened before the occupation could begin. The underlying conditions that created groups like the Alliance hadn't been addressed. The government's approach remained fundamentally reactive and punitive rather than preventive, and the operation had potentially created more extremists than it had stopped, a fact that Walsh, in 2009, DEA agent Christina Morales accepted an assignment that would require her to infiltrate a drug cartel by entering into a romantic relationship with one of its high-ranking members. But what the agency didn't prepare her for was the possibility that the feelings might become real. And when the operation ended, she would be left questioning everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, and duty. The operation destroyed her career, led to several deaths, and left her with PTSD that she's still managing more than a decade later. The target was Alejandro Ruiz, a lieutenant in the Sinaloa cartel who controlled distribution networks in Southern California. Intelligence suggested Ruiz was ambitious and potentially vulnerable to recruitment or manipulation through a romantic partner. Morales was chosen because she fit his type: intelligent, attractive, with a background that could be credibly fabricated as someone involved in money laundering. The plan was for her to meet him through mutual acquaintances, develop a relationship, gather intelligence, and eventually either flip him into becoming an informant or gather enough evidence to dismantle his network. Morales had done undercover work before, but never anything this personal. Her handler, Agent Tom Rodriguez, walked her through the protocols. She would have regular check-ins, a panic code if she felt unsafe, and clear boundaries about what she was expected to do. The relationship could be romantic, but there were lines she wasn't required to cross. Rodriguez assured her that she'd be supported and that she could pull out at any time if it became too much. The initial meeting was staged at an upscale restaurant in San Diego. Mutual contacts, themselves undercover DA assets, introduced them at what appeared to be a chance encounter. The chemistry was immediate and genuine. Ruiz was charming and attentive, nothing like the violent criminal his file suggested. He talked about art and literature, asked about her opinions on everything from politics to music, made her laugh with self-deprecating humor. Morales reminded herself it was an act, that she was there to do a job, but she also couldn't deny that she was enjoying herself in a way she hadn't expected. Ruiz was 34, educated in the United States, fluent in English and Spanish, comfortable moving between worlds. His father had been a mid-level cartel operator who'd been killed when Alejandro was 16, and he'd inherited the family business out of necessity rather than choice, or so he claimed. He spoke about the cartel with a strange mixture of pride and regret, acknowledging the violence and corruption while also defending it as the only viable economy in regions where legitimate opportunities didn't exist. Over the following weeks, they began dating. Ruiz was a gentleman, at least with her. He took her to nice dinners, introduced her to his family, treated her with respect that seemed genuine. Morales gathered useful intelligence, names of associates, locations of safe houses, details about smuggling routes and money laundering operations. She passed everything to Rodriguez, and the operation seemed to be progressing perfectly. But she was also spending hours with Ruiz when she wasn't working, and those hours felt increasingly real. They went to art galleries and discussed the paintings. They cooked dinner together in his apartment, laughing as they attempted complicated recipes. They stayed up late talking about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Ruiz told her about his mother, who died of cancer when he was young, and how he'd promised her he'd make something of himself. Morales found herself sharing real details from her own life, things that weren't part of her cover story, because the fabricated backstory didn't feel adequate for the intimacy they were building. The first time Ruiz told her he loved her, 3 months into the operation, Morales felt her stomach drop. They were walking on the beach at sunset, and he'd stopped, taken her hands, and said the words with such sincerity that she almost believed he meant them. She was supposed to say it back. It was part of the role, part of deepening the relationship to gather better intelligence. But when the words came out of her mouth, they didn't feel entirely false. She reported the development to Rodriguez, who reminded her to maintain emotional distance. She told him she was fine, that she knew what she was doing. She was lying, and some part of her knew it. 6 months into the operation, Morales witnessed Ruiz's other side for the first time. A shipment of cocaine had been intercepted by a rival group, and Ruiz believed one of his distributors had leaked the information. He'd invited Morales to what she thought would be a normal business meeting. But it turned into an interrogation. The suspected informant was brought in, tied to a chair, and questioned brutally. Ruiz didn't do the actual beating himself. He had men for that. But he directed it, asking questions in a calm voice while the man screamed and blood. The interrogation lasted 2 hours and ended with the man confessing to working with the rival group. Ruiz thanked him for his honesty, then had him killed with a single shot to the head. Morales was there, and she couldn't intervene without blowing her cover. She watched the man die, watched Ruiz's expression remain completely neutral, watched as if it were just another day at the office. Afterward, Ruiz turned to her as if nothing unusual had happened and asked if she was ready for dinner. They went to her favorite restaurant, and he was charming and attentive, and Morales felt like she was losing her mind. That night, Morales had a breakdown in her apartment. She called Rodriguez at 3 in the morning, crying, saying she couldn't do this anymore, that she'd watched someone die and done nothing. Rodriguez talked her down, reminded her that the man had been a criminal involved in drug trafficking, that his death was a consequence of the life he'd chosen. He scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day to check on her mental state and reassess the operation. But by morning, Morales had convinced herself she could push through. She told Rodriguez she was fine, that seeing Ruiz's capacity for violence had actually made it easier to remember why she was doing this, that it had reinforced the distinction between her real self and her cover identity. Rodriguez wanted to believe her because the operation was producing excellent results. He documented their conversation, noted his concerns, but ultimately allowed the operation to continue. The relationship deepened. Ruiz began trusting Morales with more sensitive information, including details about cartel leadership structure and upcoming shipments. He introduced her to his superiors, bringing her to meetings with men who controlled vast criminal enterprises. Morales was providing intelligence that led to significant arrests and seizures. The DEA considered the operation one of their most successful in years, and Rodriguez was getting pressure from above to keep it running as long as possible, to squeeze out every bit of useful information before bringing Ruiz down. But Morales was changing in ways Rodriguez couldn't see through their brief check-ins. She found herself defending Ruiz in her reports, contextualizing his actions, emphasizing the pressures he was under from cartel leadership. She wrote about his loyalty to his family, his intelligence, the complexity of his moral reasoning, the humanity she saw in him during their private moments. She described conversations where he'd expressed regret about the violence, where he'd talked about wanting to get out someday, to build something legitimate. Rodriguez started pushing back on her reports, reminding her that Ruiz was responsible for flooding American communities with drugs, that the cocaine he distributed destroyed families and killed people, that whatever personal charm he possessed didn't change the fact that he was a criminal causing enormous harm. Morales knew Rodriguez was right intellectually, but emotionally, she was struggling to reconcile the man she knew with the monster her reports were supposed to describe. The breaking point came when Morales discovered she was pregnant. She'd been careful, using contraception, but nothing is perfect. When the pregnancy test came back positive, she felt her world collapse. She told Rodriguez before she told Ruiz, and Rodriguez's response was immediate and unequivocal. She needed to terminate the pregnancy and extract herself from the operation immediately. This had crossed every line, and they needed to shut it down before it got worse. But Morales refused. She argued that ending the operation now would waste 2 years of work, that she was closer than ever to getting information that could take down the entire California distribution network. She said she could handle it, that having a child would actually strengthen her cover and Ruiz's trust in her, making him even more vulnerable and open to sharing information. Rodriguez fought her on it, called her judgment compromised, threatened to pull her out against her will. The decision went up the chain of command. Rodriguez prepared a detailed report recommending immediate extraction, citing the pregnancy and Morales's emotional involvement. But his superiors saw the intelligence Morales was providing and made a calculation. The operation was too valuable to terminate now. They overruled Rodriguez, authorized Morales to continue with additional oversight and more frequent check-ins. Rodriguez argued vehemently against the decision, putting his objections in writing, but ultimately he had to follow orders. Morales told Ruiz about the pregnancy 2 days later. His reaction was everything she hadn't expected and exactly what she'd feared. He was overjoyed, overcome with emotion in a way she'd never seen before. He talked about marriage, about leaving the cartel, about starting a legitimate life together. He said the baby was a sign, a chance to break the cycle of violence that had defined his family for generations. For a moment, Morales allowed herself to imagine it a real relationship, a real family, a life that wasn't built on lies. But then reality crashed back. Ruiz wasn't going to leave the cartel. They didn't let people walk away, especially not lieutenants who knew as much as he did. And even if he tried, she wasn't really who he thought she was. She was an undercover DEA agent, and the baby growing inside her was evidence of how completely she'd lost control of the operation. She'd crossed lines that should never be crossed. And there was no way back from this that didn't involve devastating betrayal. Over the next few months, as her pregnancy progressed, morale spiraled. She was living a double life, but the lines between the two had blurred beyond recognition. She loved Ruiz, or at least she thought she did, though she couldn't be sure if the feelings were real or just an artifact of the role she'd been playing for so long. She was carrying his child, a biological reality that transcended undercover work and created a connection that would last regardless of what happened to their relationship. And she was betraying him every day, gathering evidence that would put him in prison for life and take him away from his child. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Morales started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe, convinced she was having a heart attack. She stopped reporting everything to Rodriguez, keeping some conversations with Ruiz to herself because she couldn't bear to turn them into intelligence reports. She knew she was compromising the operation, but she couldn't stop herself. Rodriguez could see she was unraveling, but the operation had become too important politically. The intelligence Morales was providing had already led to the arrests of several cartel leaders and the disruption of major smuggling operations across the Southwest. Shutting it down now would look like failure, especially after the higher-ups had overruled Rodriguez's recommendation to extract her. Nobody wanted that on their record, so they kept pushing her, asking for just a little more time, just a few more pieces of information. When Morales was 7 months pregnant, Ruiz proposed. They were at his family's ranch outside of Tijuana, and he'd arranged an elaborate surprise with mariachi music and flowers, and his entire extended family gathered to celebrate. He gave her a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a family heirloom, and asked her to marry him in front of everyone. She said yes, because what else could she do without blowing her cover? They set a date for 2 months after the baby was due. Ruiz's family threw an engagement party that lasted 2 days, and Morales smiled and celebrated and felt like she was dying inside. The end came suddenly and violently. A rival cartel faction, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, made a move against Ruiz's operation. They'd been slowly encroaching on his territory for months, and tensions had been escalating. When they killed Ruiz's cousin in a drive-by shooting, it was a direct declaration of war. Ruiz decided to retaliate with overwhelming force, planning an attack that would kill not just the rival cartel members, but anyone associated with them, including family members and even some civilians who worked in businesses they controlled. Ruiz explained the plan to Morales because by this point he trusted her completely, sharing operational details that he wouldn't have shared months earlier. The attack would involve coordinated shootings at multiple locations across San Diego and Tijuana. designed to send a message that challenges to his authority would be met with total destruction. Morales knew she couldn't let it happen. The body count would be in the dozens, including women and children who had nothing to do with the cartel war. She called Rodriguez and told him everything. The attack was planned for 3 days from then, giving the DEA time to coordinate with Mexican authorities and local police. Rodriguez activated a massive multi-agency response, bringing in FBI, ATF, and San Diego PD. They would prevent the attack and arrest Rees and his key associates, ending the operation and Morales's nightmare. Rodriguez assured her they'd handle the extraction carefully, that they'd protect her and the baby, that she'd done the right thing. The DEA coordinated with local police and Mexican federal agents to move in during the middle of the night. They surrounded Ruiz's house, where Morales was staying, an upscale property in La Jolla with views of the ocean. Morales had been given a heads-up that the raid was coming, told to be ready to identify herself as a federal agent and cooperate with the extraction team. At 3 in the morning, she heard vehicles surrounding the property, saw tactical lights through the windows, heard voices on loudspeakers ordering everyone inside to come out with their hands up. Ruiz woke up confused, reaching for the gun he kept in the nightstand. Morales grabbed his arm, stopped him, and in that moment had to make a split-second decision about what to say. She could have maintained her cover, pretended to be as surprised as he was, let him think they were both under attack. But she couldn't do it anymore. She looked at him and said 3 words that destroyed everything. "I'm DEA, Alejandro." The look on his face broke something in her that never fully healed. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was worse. It was betrayal and disbelief, and the complete collapse of his world. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't reach for the gun. He just stared at her, and she couldn't meet his eyes. She identified herself to the tactical team, showed her badge and credentials, and watched as they took Ruiz into custody. He didn't say a word to her, didn't ask questions or demand explanations. He just looked at her belly, at the child they'd created together, and then looked away as if he couldn't bear the sight. Morales was immediately placed in protective custody and debriefed. The operation was considered a massive success by DEA standards. They'd prevented a major cartel attack that would have killed dozens. They'd arrested Ruiz and 17 of his associates, dismantling a significant distribution network. They'd seized millions of dollars in drugs, weapons, and assets. The intelligence Morales had gathered led to follow-up operations that resulted in dozens more arrests over the following months. But Morales couldn't see any of it as success. She testified against Ruiz and others in the organization, providing the evidence that led to convictions and long prison sentences. Ruiz received 25 years in federal prison, but she did it mechanically, reading from prepared statements, answering questions in a monotone voice, feeling like she was reading from a script someone else had written. The prosecutors praised her testimony as clear and damning. The defense attorneys tried to attack her credibility, suggesting that a romantic relationship with a target showed poor judgment and potential bias. Neither side understood that she wasn't functioning as a person anymore, just going through the motions. She gave birth to a daughter 3 months after Ruiz's arrest. The baby was healthy, 8 pounds and beautiful, with Ruiz's dark eyes and Morales's features. The DEA offered to help her relocate and create a new identity, standard procedure for agents whose covers had been blown and who might face retaliation. But Morales refused. She took a leave of absence that became permanent resignation. She couldn't imagine continuing to work for an agency that had put her in that situation, that had ignored the warning signs, that had prioritized the operation over her well-being and her child's. She moved to a small town in Oregon where nobody knew her, far from the California operations where she might be recognized. She bought a small house with her savings, found work doing private security consulting that paid enough to support her and her daughter. She tried to build a life that made sense, but everything felt hollow and false, as if she were still undercover, but in a role that had no clear objective. Ruiz sent letters from prison, dozens of them over the first few years. He asked to be part of their daughter's life, tried to understand why Morales had done what she'd done, oscillated between anger and pleading and resignation. She never responded to any of them. She couldn't explain to him what she barely understood herself, that the operation had required her to become someone who could love him, and that version of herself hadn't been entirely fake. She had loved him in some complicated, broken way that she couldn't reconcile with her duty as a federal agent. Using that love to destroy him had destroyed part of her too. Years later, when her daughter was old enough to ask questions about her father, Morales struggled with what to tell her. The truth was impossible to explain. Your father is in prison because I lied to him about who I was, made him fall in love with me, carried you while gathering evidence against him, and then used all of that to put him away for most of your childhood. So she told a simpler lie: your father was involved in dangerous criminal activity, and we're better off without him. She showed her daughter pictures of Ruiz from before his arrest, so she'd at least know what he looked like. But she didn't tell her the full story. But Morales knows it's more complicated than that. Ruiz was responsible for terrible things. The drugs he distributed ruined lives and destroyed families. The violence he ordered and participated in killed people. The world is probably safer with him in prison. But he was also a person who loved her, or at least loved who he thought she was. He was going to be a father, had been excited about it, had talked about changing his life. And she exploited all of that for her job. The DEA gave her commendations and awards for the operation. Her work was held up as an example of exceptional undercover tradecraft. But Morales doesn't keep the awards where she can see them. They're in a box in her closet, gathering dust, because every time she looks at them, she remembers the cost. She remembers Ruiz's face when she told him the truth. She remembers her daughter asking why she doesn't have a daddy like other kids. She remembers the nightmares that still wake her up screaming sometimes. Dreams where she's back in that bedroom watching Ruiz realize who she really is. She's been in therapy for over a decade now, working through complex PTSD and moral injury. Her therapist uses that term, moral injury, to describe the psychological damage that comes from participating in actions that violate your fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Morales had believed in justice and law enforcement, but the operation forced her to do things that felt fundamentally wrong. Manipulate someone emotionally, weaponize intimacy, bring a child into the world as part of a law enforcement operation. No amount of therapy can make that feel okay. Rodriguez, her handler, tried to stay in touch for a while after the operation ended. He sent emails checking on her, called on holidays, offered to help however he could. But Morales couldn't talk to him without feeling anger she didn't know how to express. He'd been following orders, too. Caught in the same impossible situation, but she blamed him anyway for not fighting harder to pull her out, for prioritizing the operation over her safety. Eventually, she stopped responding to his messages, and he stopped sending them. Years later, Morales learned that Rodriguez had retired from the DEA and was working as a consultant, training agents in undercover operations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She wondered if he taught them about her case, about what happens when an operation goes too far and crosses lines that can't be uncrossed. She doubted it. More likely, her operation was still held up as a success story, the messy human cost edited out of the official narrative. When her daughter turned 10, Ruiz's letters from prison stopped coming. Morales learned through unofficial channels that he'd stopped writing because his lawyer had advised him that the letters could be used against him in ongoing legal matters. But she suspected the real reason was that he'd finally given up hope of any connection with his daughter, accepted that Morales would never respond, that the family he'd imagined would never exist. Part of Morales felt relieved that the letters had stopped, that she didn't have to deal with the guilt of throwing them away unread anymore. But another part felt sad in a way she couldn't quite explain. The letters had been a connection to that time in her life, evidence that the relationship had been real to him even if it had been an operation to her. Without them, it was easier to pretend the whole thing had been just a job, just an assignment she'd completed professionally. But that wasn't true, and she knew it. So which of these stories disturbed you the most? Was it Marcus Webb, tortured in that basement room, while his handler betrayed him, his final days spent scratching desperate messages into concrete walls that might never be found? Was it Laura Santos, who lost herself completely in her cover identity and had to be put back together like a broken puzzle with pieces missing? Was it David Park, who started to believe in the ideology he was supposed to be infiltrating and ended up questioning everything he thought he knew about justice and patriotism? Or was it Christina Morales, who fell in love with her target, created a life with him, and then had to destroy him while carrying his child? These aren't just stories about operations that went wrong. They're about the human cost of asking people to become someone else for months or years, to build relationships based on lies, to compromise their morality in service of law enforcement objectives. They're about the institutional failures that happen when agencies prioritize cases over the agents working them, when handlers ignore warning signs because the intelligence is too valuable to give up, when careers and reputations become more important than the psychological well-being of the people in the field. And they're about questions that don't have easy answers. When does duty become betrayal? When does justice become oppression? When is the cost too high, even if the operation succeeds? The agencies involved will tell you these operations were necessary, that they prevented violence and disrupted criminal organizations, that the ends justified the means. But the people who lived through them might give you a different answer. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Which story got to you the most? Do you think these agents were heroes who sacrificed too much? Or do you think they were complicit in systems that use people up and throw them away? There's no right answer, but I'm curious what resonates with you. And if these stories got under your skin the way they got under mine, share this video with someone who appreciates true horror. Not the jump, scare kind, not the supernatural monsters kind, but the slow, creeping realization that sometimes the real monsters are the systems we trust, and the real horror is what we're willing to become in service of duty, or what we're willing to ask others to become. Thanks for watching, and remember, I'm Mubarok. This is Lunar Lore, and I'll see you in the next one.